Hello and welcome to the Starting Sister series, the series where we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between for the forces of the Adepta Sororitas. In this video, we'll be looking at all of the remaining HQ choices that we have not covered yet. If you're interested in learning about the Canoness or the Palatine, please check out their video specifically, and if you would like to know about Junith Eurita, you can find her information within the order of our Martyred Lady video specifically. With that being said, let's take a look at the remaining HQ choices, beginning with Celestine. Celestine used to see some level of play within the 8th edition codex. However, in her 9th edition codex incarnation, she has become ubiquitous within lists of Sisters of Battle. So what has changed for Celestine going into 9th edition? To begin with, no longer is Celestine and the Geminae Superior separate units, but rather they are now one unit that costs a total of 200 points and includes one Celestine with two Geminae Superior, meaning you can no longer break them up. However, both have seen a decent amount of improvement. And to take a look at Celestine specifically, she has a rather amazing profile with a 12-inch movement speed that's actually faster than just that initial 12 inches, considering that she has the fly keyword, making her even more mobile, and she can deep strike with her Geminae Superior into the battle, utilizing her Sky Strike ability. In addition to that, she also has access to the stratagem known as Angelic Ascent, which costs 1 command point and lets her go back into deep strike mode if you so desire for 1 command point, considering her unit has the jump pack keyword. All of this contributes to her exceptional mobility. And as her durability goes, she's incredibly potent there as well, with a total of 6 wounds, a 2+ normal save, and a 4+ invulnerable save, as well as a damage reduction of 1 to a minimum of 1 damage, thanks to her armor of St. Katherine. Though like all Sisters units, she only has 3 toughness, which is a little bit awkward, considering that does expose her to some light arms fire, making that toughness of 3 a significant issue, considering most small fire will only have a damage characteristic of 1, meaning that reduction doesn't come into play, and it will usually come in big enough volume to overpower some of those rather efficient saves, while having a low enough strength profile where that toughness will come into play. However, in terms of durability, Celestine does have a few things that will keep her alive throughout the game. The first one being is that those Geminae Superior have an ability called Life Warders, meaning that all of the damage has to be allocated to the Geminae Superior before it is allocated to Celestine. As such, the Geminae Superior can tank some of the wounds, and each of those Geminae Superior have 2 wounds each with a 2+ normal save and a 4+ invulnerable save. Though like their leader Celestine, they do only have a toughness of 3, making them unfortunately vulnerable to some of the same aspects that Celestine is vulnerable to. Though in the situation that your opponent takes down your Geminae Superior and then takes down your Celestine, Celestine does have one other ability to keep her rather healthy. This ability is called Miraculous Intervention, and it says that the first time Celestine is destroyed, you roll a d6 and on a 2+, Celestine comes back to life with her full wound profile and outside of engagement range, but as close as possible to where she was destroyed. This means that Celestine essentially has 2 lives and a total of roughly 12 wounds that you have to go through in 2 different sets, meaning that she's actually a little more durable than if she only had 12 wounds, because after she goes down and stands back up, all of that previous damage is lost. And the one thing I don't like about this ability is that there's always that chance of failing it on a 1, so there are going to be those really feel bad situations where you roll a 1 on a very critical turn, and Celestine happens to not get back up, meaning that the ability essentially did nothing, and all of a sudden you're out of luck in a really critical part of the game. I really wish they just made this an ability that happens no matter what, as opposed to an ability where you have a 1 in 6 chance of accidentally failing and losing out on what's otherwise an incredibly powerful ability that can make or break a game. Finally, in terms of durability, Celestine does have one other ability that is called Healing Tears. And what Healing Tears does is it's an action that begins in your command phase and ends at the end of your shooting phase. What this action does is that it either attempts to revive one Geminae Superior or restore lost wounds when the action is completed. This ability used to be a little better as it was not an action, and you have to remember that when an action is performed, the unit performing the action pretty much can't do anything, so it does have to wait for the action to be completed until it can function again, which is a rather big downside. That being said, luckily this action does have some special timing, as this action begins in your command phase and ends in your shooting phase. It means you can't shoot, but it does mean you can still perform charge actions, so you're not completely losing your turn just to heal up or to simply revive your Geminae Superior, meaning that there are definitely going to be situations where it's worthwhile using this so that you can either heal up or revive before making a charge roll and getting into combat. More so, you should consider the fact that losing out on shooting is not always the worst thing in the world, considering sometimes you want to get into combat so that you can be protected against certain threats in your opponent's shooting phase. As such, there are going to be times where you simply don't want to shoot so that you have a better chance of making charge rolls or simply staying within that combat, as opposed to destroying the enemy and then finding your Celestine unit stuck in the middle of nowhere out in the open for your opponent to shoot at. In addition to all these abilities, obviously Celestine has access to Acts of Faith, Sacred Rites, and Shield of Faith, making her even a little more durable and having a little ability to customize some of what she has thanks to those Sacred Rites. Now, something else that's kind of interesting about Celestine is that she has a few defensive abilities that extend beyond herself and onto other units. As we already saw, the Healing Tears allows her to benefit her Geminae Superia, however that's still within her unit, but something like Angelic Savior, which allows her unit to heroically intervene, can help out friendly units by making it much harder for your opponent to charge your units without risking the wrath of your Celestine and her Geminae Superia. Though heroic intervention is not something particularly out of character for character units, so this isn't the most exciting ability. What is actually somewhat exciting is her Saintly Blessing Aura. Her Saintly Blessing Aura says that friendly Imperium units within 6 inches gain a 6+ invulnerable save. What's interesting about this is that it does benefit Imperium units and not just Adepta Sororitas units, and seeing as most Sisters of Battle will already have Shield of Faith, this wouldn't have actually helped them that much, but this does show that Celestine might have some applications within some kind of soup list that people might not be considering initially. And I can definitely see some kind of situation where you bring Celestine and a bunch of Mortifiers and Penitent engines in order to support something like Imperial Guard. Though on the other hand, certain armies like Adeptus Mechanicus already have that invulnerable save, so they don't really benefit from this on that end. However, as mentioned with other situations, it's still a rather interesting ability, considering that lately we've seen a push keep armies mono-faction as opposed to being souped. Though there are definitely applications for this ability even within mono-faction, as you do have Ministorum units that aren't necessarily Adepta Sororitas units, so this definitely does apply to them and can be situationally rather useful, so do keep that in mind when building a list. Finally, if she happens to take a Warlord trait, she is required to take the Warlord trait known as Indomitable Belief, which gives her an aura that says friendly Sister Corps infantry units within 6 inches gain +1 to their Shield of Faith invulnerable save, which caps out at a maximum of a 4+ invulnerable save. This is a perfectly fine Warlord trait to have if you have core infantry sister units that you wish to protect, and can be an okay addition, though in a lot of situations you are going to find better Warlord traits to take. Now that we understand the durability aspects of Celestine, let's take a look at what she brings in terms of offensive capabilities, which she has plenty of as well, in addition to her exceptional durability. Celestine herself is armed with one weapon, being the Ardent Blade. The Ardent Blade both has a shooting profile and a melee profile. The shooting profile of the Ardent Blade functions like a flamer in that it automatically hits whenever making attacks, and in addition to that, it has a variable d6 assault shots, just like many flamer weapons. It has a 12-inch range and a strength of 6 with 2 armor penetration and 1 damage. Being an assault weapon, it further increases Celestine's mobility as it allows her to advance and still fire without assault profile, and because it is a flamer style weapon that automatically hits, she doesn't really even suffer a negative modifier to it. In addition to that, because this weapon has a 12-inch range, she can deep strike into battle and fire this weapon, and you don't even necessarily have to worry about destroying enemies that are 9 inches away and failing the charge, because she does have Acts of Faith, and you can use Miracle Dice in order to pass the charge roll automatically. Not only that, but the 2 armor penetration and the 6 strength does make her very capable of destroying mid-range units. The melee profile of the Ardent Blade is even more impressive, considering that Celestine comes baseline with 6 attacks, and with the additional 4 strength that the Ardent Blade offers, it brings her up to a total of 7 strength, meaning that she'll be rather effective in taking out mid-range and heavy armor units, especially when you consider that this weapon has 4 armor penetration and deals 2 damage a wound. Though even with all this in mind, the Ardent Blade has yet another ability within melee, which says that an unmodified hit roll of 6 automatically inflicts 2 mortal wounds, but does not go on to do its normal damage as that attack sequence ends. And that means for every 6 you roll, you're essentially inflicting 2 mortal wounds without even having to make a wound roll. And as she has 6 attacks, you're on average going to be inflicting 2 mortal wounds in addition to any normal damage she has, with the ability to high roll and inflict more than that. As such, Celestine is actually really good at taking out priority targets if she can get a melee combo with them, and considering she can deep strike onto the table, fire her shooting, and then automatically pass her charge roll, it makes her all the more threatening to your opponent. So your opponent will have to always screen very carefully or risk their units being taken out by a Celestine. In addition to that, because Celestine and the Geminae are one unit, they both deep strike together and make the charge together, giving her that extra bit of output. Speaking of the Geminae Superior, let's look at what they bring to the table in terms of offensive capabilities. To begin with, the Geminae are armed with a bolt pistol, a power sword, and frag and crack grenades. The bolt pistol is nothing particularly impressive, but with that power sword, each Geminae Superior makes 3 attacks with a strength of 4, 3 armor penetration, and 1 damage per wound. And their weapon skill is a reasonable 3+ in comparison to Celestine's weapon skill of 2+. and this means that the Geminae Superior can definitely put out some additional damage, though with only 4 strength, they're definitely going to have a much harder time taking out some of those targets that Celestine has a much easier time of being in melee combat with. However, considering you're getting 6 additional attacks from the Geminae Superior at that high armor penetration, even though it's a low strength, you're still probably going to sneak through at least 1 additional wound in most situations. And considering you get all of this for 200 points, it's a pretty amazing deal, and it's why Celestine has become so common within army lists. Considering she has all the mobility in the world, incredible durability, and some rather impressive damage output for bringing all that, I definitely recommend checking her out as she's an incredible model on top of all of those things. Celestine isn't the only special character that has made a big impact on how Sisters of Battle play, considering that the new character, Morvenn Vahl, has probably seen as much play as Celestine, if not potentially more. Morvenn Vahl is an incredible character that costs a total of 265 points and functions as a supreme commander to the Sisters of Battle, meaning that if she's taken within an army, she must be the warlord of the Sisters of Battle. So what does Morvenn Vahl bring to the table? To begin with, she has a rather reasonable 8-inch movement speed, so she's a little bit slower than Celestine, and she doesn't have all those additional perks to help her mobility like flying or deep strike, but 8 inches is definitely faster than your average sister. In addition to that, she has some impressive durability components, such as having a toughness of 5, which is much higher than what sisters normally come with. She also has a wound characteristic of 8, making her a rather resilient target. In addition to that, she comes with a 2+ normal save, a 4+ invulnerable save, and a 4+ feel no pain save against mortal wounds. And as we've been seeing in the meta, things like mortal wounds have really taken off when you look at something like the 2000 point Admech list or the 2000 point Necron list, which both include a ton of different ways to generate those mortal wounds, so that 4+ feel no pain save goes much further than you would expect. In addition to this, she has the Holy Aegis ability, which reduces all damage received to half or rounded up. This is actually better than a lot of similar abilities, because not only does it oftentimes have a bigger impact than -1 damage, it actually benefits from her toughness of 5, considering all of a sudden small arms fire doesn't affect her as much as a lot of the toughness 3 units like Celestine or the Canoness, making her all the harder to destroy, especially since your opponent actually has to start investing firepower into her that might have a damage characteristic 2 or higher in a lot of situations. Therefore, you'll be getting a lot more mileage out of that Holy Aegis. Now when it comes to offensive capabilities, Morvenn Vahl comes with quite a lot of ability to put out that damage. To begin with, let's take a look at her ranged weapons. She starts off with her more potent heavy bolter known as Fidelis. Fidelis has a 36-inch range with 3 heavy shots at a strength 6, 1 armor penetration, and 2 damage. Heavy bolters are always a perfectly fine choice, and having a slightly better heavy bolter is never a bad thing to have, so this is definitely an okay start, though it wouldn't really push me into a unit that costs almost 300 points. In addition to her heavy bolter, she has the Paragon missile launcher, considering she is a Paragon warsuit, and the Paragon missile launcher has 2 different profiles at 36 inches of range for both these profiles. The first of these profiles is the Sanctorum missiles, which is a profile designed to take out swarm units, having 2d6 heavy shots at a strength of 4 and 1 damage, but being a blast weapon. And this essentially makes it akin to that of a regular bolter weapon, and it's more of something that you just happen to have if you ever really need to target a swarm, as opposed to something you'd be using primarily in most situations. The more interesting profile is the Prioris missiles, having 2 heavy shots at a strength of 8, 2 armor penetration, and d6 damage. This is pretty much as close as you can get to being a melta weapon without actually being a melta weapon, and as we already know, melta weapons are incredibly powerful within 9th edition. In fact, anytime you see a profile like this, it's definitely something that's rather potent and can do some serious damage against all kinds of targets. One thing I'll mention is that unfortunately she does have that d6 damage as opposed to having that much more potent d3 plus 3 damage like we're starting to see with some heavy weapons such as the Canoness las cannon. And I should also mention the Prioris profile does not have the blast keyword, meaning that it can be fired within close combat, as Morvenn Vahl does have the vehicle keyword, which makes her even more potent within melee combat. And speaking of melee combat, she does come with a rather impressive melee weapon known as the Lance of Illumination. And the Lance of Illumination, like the Paragon missile launcher, does have 2 profiles, with the first profile being the sweeping blows that is also designed to clear out swarms, considering that as a special ability that says for every hit roll she makes 2 hit rolls instead, giving her a total of 10 attacks, considering she has 5 attacks baseline. The Sweeping Blows profile also uses her base strength of 5 and gives her 2 armor penetration and 1 damage per attack. And this isn't that bad of a profile, considering that 2 armor penetration is reasonable enough, and having a strength of 5 is enough to deal with a lot of those mid-range units that have a toughness of 5 within the current meta, meaning that even though this is an anti-swarm profile, it still has its applications against mid-range units, so she does have a lot of ability with that special bolter and the Paragon missiles to really wreak havoc against medium durability units that you might encounter in certain armies. Now, the second melee profile is the Lunging Strikes, and this is more of a bunker buster profile that pairs very well with the second profile of the Paragon Missile Launcher, as it brings her strength up to a total of 8 and gives her 3 armor penetration and 3 damage per hit. In addition to that, an unmodified wound roll of 6 deals 1 mortal wound in addition to her normal damage. This means you'll put out 5 strength 8 attacks at that high armor penetration and damage, in addition to 2 Paragon Missile shots at a strength of 8 and those heavy bolter shots at a strength of 6. As such, you can take out armored targets very efficiently with Morvenn Vahl. In addition to all these different profiles, she even has some special abilities that help her out within melee combat as well. The first of those abilities being Righteous Repugnance. And what Righteous Repugnance does is that once per battle, at the end of the fight phase, she can fight again. This means you get another chance of making attacks with either of those sweeping blows or lunging strikes, giving you a potential of 20 attacks with the sweeping blows or 10 attacks with those lunging strikes within 1 turn, meaning that once a game she can pretty much obliterate anything she finds herself in combat with. In addition to that, she is a vehicle, so she does explode in the situation that she is destroyed, dealing mortal wounds to all units around her, meaning that even if she happens to go down, she does put out that last little bit of damage. And if you happen to take a Warlord trait on her, you do have to take Righteous Rage, which isn't the worst Warlord trait to take on such a powerful melee unit as she is. Now, considering Morvenn Vahl is a commander of the Adepta Sororitas forces, she isn't just a threat in herself, but she benefits other units around her as well, and to show this benefit, she does have 2 force multiplier abilities that do help other units around her. The first of those abilities is the Abyss Cinctora Mora, which says friendly sister core units within 6 inches can reroll hit and wound rolls of 1. And notice I said friendly sister core units and not specific order units, as this ability is not order locked, meaning that she benefits anyone regardless of their order, so she can benefit quite a lot more units than a normal Canoness or a Palatine can, with this aura ability that functions much like the Canoness and Palatine rolled into one. The second of these abilities that Morvenn Vahl comes with is called the Commander of the Adepta Sororitas, and this ability says, in your command phase, select a friendly sister core or character unit within 6 inches, and until your next command phase, they can reroll the hit and wound roll for their attacks. This is an even stronger ability, considering it doesn't just affect ones, but affects all the different rolls within the hit and wound roll, making this an even more potent version of that primary ability. However, it is restricted to only targeting 1 unit, and that unit has to be within range, and as such, there is that limitation to it. However, when this comes into full effect, this can definitely have a rather significant impact on the game, and abilities like this, especially in armies like the Sisters, that can have a lot of special weapons on different core units, do have a lot more viability than they might in other factions that have a much more limited scope of what their core units can do. As such, Morvenn Vahl is definitely a monster in terms of offensive output that can destroy most of your opponent's threats utilizing her different abilities, while at the same time functioning as a rather potent force multiplier. Though do consider that if you're only trying to use her as a force multiplier, there might be better options for that. You should really be considering her offensive capabilities before you consider some of her ability to be a force multiplier. Following Celestine and Morvenn Vahl is yet another special character for the Sisters of Battle that can be taken as an HQ choice. This special character is actually 2 characters in 1 unit, being Ephrael Stern and Kyganil of the Bloody Tears. This pair will cost you a total of 120 points, and inversely to Morvenn Vahl, who must be your warlord, this pair cannot be your warlord. So what does this band of 2 units do? Let's take a look at their individual stats. To begin with, we're going to look at Ephrael Stern, who is the Sister of Battle within this pair of models, and she has a pretty decent profile, having an 8-inch movement speed, 6 wounds, and a 3+ normal save, as well as a 4+ invulnerable save, and she gives enemies -1 to their hit and wound rolls against her because of her Divine Protection ability. This is already a pretty decent profile, but once again, she suffers from having toughness 3. For weapons, she does come with a bolt pistol and a melee weapon known as Sanctity. Sanctity is a perfectly fine melee weapon, giving her 2 additional strength, bringing her up to a total of 6 strength. This is actually a pretty interesting thing to note, because she does start out with a total of 4 strength, making her a little bit stronger than most normal sisters who only have a base strength of 3. And in addition to that, Sanctity gives her 3 armor penetration and 2 damage per wound. Though more importantly, it also ignores invulnerable saves that opposing models may have. This means that Ephrael is essentially dealing mortal wounds with this weapon, considering her high armor penetration and her ability to ignore invulnerable saves. As such, it's actually kind of interesting considering she has a 2+ weapon skill, making her rather accurate with this weapon as well, and a total of 5 attacks. As such, when she's within melee combat, she can actually do quite a bit of damage, and remember, a lot of feel no pains. Nowadays specify they only work against mortal saves, so having this kind of ability to ignore mortal wounds and a high armor penetration can go a little bit further than mortal wounds can in some situations. In addition to this, Ephrael has a special ability known as Bolts of Holy Judgment, and this ability states that at the start of your shooting phase, you roll 2d6, and then you add 2 to the result if there are any chaos units within 18 inches of Ephrael, and on a 5+, the nearest enemy unit within 18 inches that is also visible to Ephrael suffers d3 mortal wounds, though if the result did add up to 10 or more, that unit suffers d6 mortal wounds instead. This ability in itself is not that particularly exciting, but on average it will be inflicting mortal wounds, and having an ability that passively generates mortal wounds is never bad to have, especially when taking note that mortal wounds are becoming more and more prevalent within the meta. This is definitely a decent way to generate some additional mortal wounds throughout the game, and it's definitely an ability that is potent enough to be considered worthwhile, especially considering Ephrael has a particularly decent melee profile to begin with. Now her older counterpart, known as Kyganil, is no slouch either. He has the same 8-inch movement speed, though he only has 5 wounds, and a 6+ normal save. However, he does benefit from that Divine Protection ability, which means he has a 4+ vulnerable save, as well as giving enemies -1 to hit and -1 to wound when they're targeting his unit. For weapons, Kyganil comes with 2 different melee options, being Kyganil's Kiss and Outcast Blades, for his total of 4 melee attacks. Kyganil's Kiss is a melee weapon that brings his strength up to a total of 4 at 1 armor penetration and 2 damage per attack. This is nothing particularly special, and honestly this makes Kyganil a rather weak melee threat. The Outcast Blades don't really benefit him that much either, considering they utilize his strength, which he only has 3 of, making him a rather weak hitter within melee combat. And the Outcast Blades have 1 armor penetration and 1 damage, however he does make 2 hit rolls instead of 1 whenever making attacks with the Outcast Blades, meaning he makes a total of 8 attacks. This generally gives him some ability to put out some weak attacks against enemy units and helps clear out swarms, whereas Ephrael is more of the heavy hitter. In all honesty, Kyganil's attacks are just a little bit of an extra bonus, and what you're really paying for is Ephrael's melee profile, as well as her Holy Bolt abilities, which makes sense considering this is a sister's army, and she is the sister of battle within this unit. However, Kyganil does have a couple special abilities that help contribute to Ephrael's survivability, as well as melee abilities. Let's take a look at those 2 special abilities that he has. The first of those abilities being Mysterious Savior, which means damage allocated to this unit has to be allocated to Kyganil first, and this ability also gives Kyganil a 5+ Feel No Pain save. Considering his 4+ invulnerable save and his negative modifier to enemy hit and wound rolls, this actually makes Kyganil surprisingly durable at soaking damage for Ephrael, and does make him a lot more interesting than if he just had his normal profile that we discussed already. In addition to this ability that gives him quite a lot of durability and the ability to protect Ephrael, he does have another ability called Night of Shadows. And Night of Shadows says that if Kyganil is alive at the start of the fight phase, this unit can fight first within that phase. This means that while Kyganil's output isn't that impressive, he does allow the unit to fight first, which means they get their damage in before the opponent can swing back, and as such, not only does it make their output a little higher, it also gives them a little more durability as they can attack first, take out some enemies, and then when the enemies attack back, Kyganil can tank all of the damage with his special ability and his Feel No Pain save, as well as his vulnerable save, even with his rather low toughness of 3. In addition to this, Ephrael and Kyganil have a couple of shared abilities, such as the Zealot ability, but interestingly enough, neither Ephrael nor Kyganil have access to Sacred Rites, Acts of Faith, or Shield of Faith. Not having access to Acts of Faith definitely does reduce their ability to do some interesting tricks, and I think that's what really drops this unit down in the rankings in comparison to the 2 previous choices that have a lot more output and a lot more capability to affect the battlefield even without these abilities, whereas this one probably suffers more from the lack of these abilities than some of the other choices on this list. Finally, to wrap up this unit, there are 2 more abilities that need to be discussed. The first one being Wanderers, which just gives the pair the ability to deep strike, though being able to deep strike on a melee unit is never a bad thing to have. However, once again, not having Acts of Faith does definitely make making charge rolls out of deep strike that much harder. However, one thing to mention, it is a decently easy way of getting Ephrael into range to use her Holy Bolt ability against a specific target, so there is that little bit of utility in that sense, and they can still potentially naturally make a charge, so it's not a complete loss in that sense either. And finally, the last ability they have is called Demonofuge, which is simply an aura that gives a -1 leadership to Chaos units within 6 inches, and if a Chaos unit fails a morale test within 6 inches of range of this unit, 1 additional model automatically flees. All in all, I would say Ephrael Stern and Kyganil are definitely interesting units and can definitely have some applications within the battlefield, considering that a point cost of 120 isn't particularly extreme, and having that ability to generate some of those mortal wounds in addition to having a rather interesting attack profile does give them a lot more ability to see play, and I can definitely see them showing up on the battlefield as sort of an additional HQ choice that goes around and acts as a nuisance to your opponent's units. However, I will also add that the Sisters of Battle have plenty of ways of generating mortal wounds and have some really incredible melee options as it is, so it is a little bit of a detriment to this unit choice. However, having the ability to do both those things on one unit is a little bit unique, especially when you consider the durability that this unit has. In addition to all of that, it does become rather exciting, and the points cost is low enough where it's definitely something I would consider when building a list, though the power level of Celestine and Morvenn Vahl in terms of how much output they have does make me more hesitant to include this unit as well. Following these three really impressive HQ choices for the Sisters of Battle, we come to our first and only generic HQ choice, being the Missionary. The Missionary is similar to the Preacher, which is an elite choice. However, the Missionary takes up an HQ choice and costs as little as 40 points, making him the lowest costing HQ choice for the Sisters of Battle, as well as one of the lowest costing priest choices within the faction as a whole. The Missionary does not have a particularly impressive stat line, having a rather generic movement profile of 6 inches, a weapon skill and ballistic skill of 4+, as well as a low strength and toughness of 3, with a total of 4 wounds, and a 6+ basic save, as well as a 4+ invulnerable save, thanks to his Rosarius, and his weapon choices aren't particularly impressive either, being an auto pistol, a servo stubber, and a power maul. These weapon choices are similar to a basic bolter, and are mostly there just to give him a tiny bit of output. The power maul is the only one that's at all interesting, considering it brings him up to a total of 6 strength, 1 armor penetration, and 1 damage. Though that being said, considering he has a weapon skill of 4+ as mentioned before, it definitely has a lot of potential to miss, and he only has a total of 3 attacks. There are some choices to swap out this war gear for alternative loadouts. None of the alternatives are that particularly impressive, and for the most part you can leave the basic war gear on him and do perfectly fine with him as well. Now, one other thing to mention is that the Missionary only has a Zealot ability, considering he is a Ministorum unit and not a Sisters of Battle unit, meaning that he does not have access to Acts of Faith, Shield of Faith, or Sacred Rites, making him a little bit weaker in that situation as well, so definitely it's better to consider the Canoness or the Palatine before him in most situations, unless you're really desperate for points or simply want another priest model in your army and don't have the space within your elite choice to bring one of the other options, and that could definitely happen, as points are definitely at a premium in the Sisters of Battle forces, and the elite slot is definitely a crowded slot to choose from. Now, what else does the Missionary bring? Well, he is a priest, so he does know different hymns, coming with the basic war hymn and one other war hymn that he can select from a list. We covered the war hymns in more detail within the special rules of the Sisters of Battle, so do go check out that video if you're interested in learning more about the different war hymns that the Sisters of Battle can have. He has one other special ability called Emboldened by Prayer, which is an aura ability that says Adeptus Ministorum core units within 6 inches of this model can use his leadership of 8 instead of their normal leadership. Nothing particularly impressive, and nothing particularly that would make me want to bring him over other options if I was just considering this ability alone. As always mentioned before, the Missionary is just a low-cost HQ option that has the ability to utilize hymns to some extent, and as such you'll see him pop up in lists from time to time, but I don't think he's going to be the core of any army, neither does he bring particularly anything impressive to an army that other units couldn't bring in place of him. That doesn't mean you should discount him completely, as he does have his uses, but it's definitely not a unit that is impressive as the previous units on this list. And finally, to wrap up all the HQ choices of the Sisters of Battle, the last HQ is yet another named character known as the Triumph of St. Katherine. The Triumph of St. Katherine is 220 points, and is a unit that used to see quite a lot of play, but has since fallen off due to the changes that it experienced going into 9th edition. We'll take a look at what made this unit a little worse going into 9th, and why it's not seeing any play, which is a rather shame because it's a very beautiful model that I wish would see more use on the tabletop due to how impressive it looks. To begin with, for the amount of points you're paying for this unit, the stat profile is nothing particularly special, having a 6-inch movement speed, and while this is a rather standard movement speed, it actually is a lot slower than it may appear at first glance. The reason being that this unit cannot embark in transports, and meaning that unlike most units that have a 6-inch characteristic, there is no way of improving the movement speed of this unit, especially when you consider it not only cannot embark on a transport, but it can't deep strike or infiltrate either. In addition to that, the durability isn't particularly impressive either, considering that this model has 18 wounds, though only a toughness characteristic of 3 and a 3+ normal save, as well as a 4+ invulnerable save, with an extra modifier of having -1 to hit. At the very least, it does have a special rule that for purposes of different rules and special abilities, this character is considered having a wounds profile of 9 instead of 18, so at least it gains a little bit of benefit in that sense, but I still think the general profile is a little weak. So what does this model bring in terms of offensive capabilities? Well, for ranged weapons, it only has 6 bolt pistols and no other ranged weapons. This isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's definitely nothing to write home about, considering that bolt pistols are plentiful within the forces of Adepta Sororitas and aren't particularly impressive weapons. For melee weapons, things do get a little better, considering that the Triumph of St. Katherine has a 3+ weapon skill and comes with 10 attacks baseline, though the number of attacks do reduce as this model loses wounds, meaning that it's not always going to get those full 10 attacks. For those 10 basic attacks, the model is armed with relic weapons, which brings its attack profile up to a total of 5 strength with 1 armor penetration and 1 damage. Not the worst thing in the world, but once again, these are pretty lightweight attacks, and considering it can have as low as 2 attacks at its minimum wounds profile, it's not something you can rely on to put out quite a good amount of damage. Now, in addition to the relic weapons, this model does come with the Martyr Sword. The Martyr Sword makes attacks at a total of 6 strength with 3 armor penetration and 2 damage per wound. This Martyr Sword has a special ability that says this model makes 4 additional attacks every melee combat with this weapon, and can only make a total of 4 attacks with this weapon. So this is a little bit of a silver lining, and this model can definitely put out some damage in melee combat when you combine the relic weapons, the Martyr Sword, and the bolt pistols. That being said, a character like Celestine or Morvenn Vahl will put out quite a lot more significant damage within melee than this unit will. What really made the Triumph of St. Katherine stand out in the past, and is still present within this codex, is the Relics of the Matriarch's ability. The Relics of the Matriarch's ability says that this model starts with 6 relics at its full profile of 18 wounds, and as this model loses wounds, it loses relics, but if the model regains wounds, it regains those relics, and each of these relics has a special ability, and you get to choose which relics are lost or gained as this model's wound profile is changed. Not only that, but this model has to go down to half wounds before it loses 2 of its relics, and then it has to be at 4 or less wounds to go down to 2 relics, which is the minimum number of relics that this model can carry. So let's take a look at what these relics do and how they behave on the battlefield, because there's quite a lot of flavor to these different relics, considering each one represents a different order militant within the forces of the Sisters of Battle. The first of these relics is the Fiery Heart, and this relic gives this model an aura ability that says Sisters core units within 6 inches automatically pass all of their morale tests. Now this isn't the most impressive ability, but it's a nice perk to have considering there are 5 other relics to go. This wouldn't be that big of an issue. Now do keep in mind, there's one very important thing to notice about this relic, and that is the addition of that core keyword that wasn't present in the 8th edition codex. The second relic that this model carries, and probably the most important relic, is the Censer of the Sacred Rose. And what the Censer of the Sacred Rose does is that you gain 1 miracle dice at the start of each battle round. This is definitely a decent ability to have, and miracle dice are a very critical commodity for the Sisters of Battle, and this is probably the reason you would take this model, considering miracle dice are incredibly powerful and they can be used pretty much anywhere. In addition to that, there is a secondary that helps you gain victory points with the utilization of miracle dice. However, that being said, in 8th edition, this ability used to be a little more powerful, considering that said you gain 1 miracle dice at the start of every turn, meaning you would get 1 on your turn and 1 on your opponent's turn. So this ability definitely saw a bit of a nerf going into 9th edition as well. And with that being said, the Censer of the Sacred Rose is definitely a relic you would keep to the very end until this model is destroyed, unlike some of the other relics which you can pretty much discard as you see fit. Now the third relic that the Triumph carries is the Simulacrum of the Ebon Chalice. And this relic gives this model an aura that says, at the start of your shooting phase, you roll a d6 for each enemy unit within 6 inches, and you add +1 to the result if that enemy is a Psyker or a Chaos unit, and if it happens to be both a Chaos unit and a Psyker, then you add +2 instead. On a score of 5+, the enemy unit suffers d3 mortal wounds. Now this isn't a particularly bad ability to have, but do remember this unit is incredibly slow moving, and unlike Ephrael Stern and Kyganil, it cannot deep strike into battle and utilize this ability in that sense. More so, the range is significantly shorter, being 3 times shorter than that of Ephrael Stern, though it does hit all units within that range as opposed to one selected unit that is visible. So at least that's a little bit of a silver lining. However, for this ability to hit more than 1 unit within a turn, it's definitely a bit of a stretch, and you're probably not going to be in many situations where that happens, considering your opponent can easily play around the mobility of this unit specifically. Though maybe if you park it on an objective, it can be a little bit of a deterrent against enemy forces taking that objective, unless they wish to destroy this unit, which does have a little bit of durability thanks to the high wound profile and the somewhat decent melee weapons that it does come armed with. Now the fourth relic is the Petals of the Bloody Rose, and this is yet another aura ability that says friendly sister core units within 6 inches gain +1 to their hit roll of melee attack rolls. This further confirms the melee abilities of this model, but do remember that those Repentia are probably going within a Rhino, and that anything like the Zephyr are a lot more mobile than this unit, so in many cases it's going to be very hard to utilize this ability to its full effect. However, maybe if this unit is in range of something like the Retributors, it can help them a little bit in combat before the Retributors are destroyed within melee combat, so at least there's a little bit of potential there, or if it's sitting on an objective like previously noted. The fifth relic is the Icon of the Valorous Heart, and it says that all 6 sacred rites are active for the bearer of this relic. And that's definitely a decent enough perk, but once again the best sacred rites are the melee rites, so once again this is a little bit awkward due to the slow mobility of this unit, though this is more of an additional benefit and not something that you're necessarily worried about losing or gaining, though sometimes it'll be nice to have access to all 6 sacred rites as opposed to any one specific sacred rite. However, normally I think you'd be perfectly fine if you only had access to one, so this is a bit of a mediocre relic at best, and once again nothing that I'm particularly excited about. The sixth and final relic is the Simulacrum of the Argent Shroud, and this relic says once per battle round, when you perform an act of faith for a friendly sister's core or character unit within 6 inches, you can change the value to 6 before utilizing it for that act of faith. And again, not the worst ability, but once again that pesky core keyword is there to kind of ruin your day so that it's a little harder to utilize than it once was before. As a whole, I think the biggest problem with the Triumph of St. Katherine is that it's a very slow model, can't increase its movement speed in any practical way if at all, and as such, it does suffer from that significantly considering how many melee benefits that has and how much ability your opponent will have to play around this model before it can ever reach melee combat. And in addition to that, the changes to its abilities going into 9th edition definitely hurt the power level, and the addition of the core restrictions did not help at all either, so now it can't really benefit things like the Exorcist tank as easily as it could before, and it's not the most durable unit either, so there are some issues in that sense as well. It would be interesting to see if this model could get a bit of a points decrease so that maybe it had a little more potential on the tabletop, though I do think Celestine and Morvenn Vahl definitely outshine this to such a great degree that it's very hard to include the Triumph of St. Katherine in your army list even if it was less points, considering that it doesn't really fit any specific category, and everything it does is a little bit underwhelming, and none of it particularly makes me that excited. I'm not sure how it changes the unit because even a points decrease wouldn't necessarily solve some of the problems that it has, though if it did experience a significant points decrease, at least it would have some potential as an additional HQ choice after you've taken your powerful HQ choices first, and maybe you get some playability in that sense. Though that being said, I think the biggest problem is the kit of this unit, sort of like Belisarius' Call within the Adeptus Mechanicus, where you can't really fix the unit without significantly changing its kit, which is a little bit sad because both the Triumph of St. Katherine and Belisarius' Call are absolutely amazing models that I would love to see on the tabletop, but unfortunately outside of incredibly casual games, I don't think that's going to be happening anytime soon. However, I would be very happy to be proven wrong in this situation. And as always, if you've enjoyed the content, like and subscribe as it really does help the channel out, and if you get the opportunity, please do share the channel as that not only massively helps the channel, but also helps the people who may discover it and benefit from the content. I would also like to give a quick shout out to my patrons. You guys are awesome people. Thank you very much for supporting the channel, and regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day.